Kia ora koutou. I think you've summarised my speech. I have found myself in a bunch of weird places and I'm going to be telling you about some of them. But thank you very much for having me along tonight. So I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about my degree and then also two of the jobs that I've had, and I'm happy to expand on anything if you have any questions. So I enrolled at Otago in 1990, and that explains that hairdo. That was quite normal back then, so yeah. And I lived in the infamous pink flat, the door, which was a terrible flat actually on the inside, but we loved the door. Go figure. So I enrolled at Otago to study history, and I was following my passion. I loved history. It's the classic story. I had a great history teacher who really motivated me, but also my family was really interested in history and genealogy. It was just part of our kind of DNA. I'm not going to lie, I was worried about doing that because a lot of my friends were doing more vocational courses. You know, they were going off to teaching or nursing and they knew kind of where they were heading with that. But what I knew about history was I was going to love it. I was going to be studying something that really mattered and I cared about it a lot. It's going to be more interesting than some other options that potentially might have given me a more clear career path. And I knew I was going to learn some really good critical thinking skills and so on. But I didn't know where my pathway would lead. And at that point in time, I knew about two kinds of jobs you could do with a history degree. One was teaching. My father was actually the person who selected students for Teachers College, and he'd already told me he would never select me in a million years. I'd be hopeless, I didn't have any patience, and I couldn't do that. So that was sort of off the table. And the only other job that I really knew about in the history space was the Waitangi Tribunal. So I sort of visualised that and thought, well, I'll go work at the Waitangi Tribunal because that's the only other job really that there is. So I took everything I could in the New Zealand history space. I was lucky enough that when I started at Otago, the Māori Studies Department had just been established, and I did Te Reo Māori, Te Ao Māori and Māori land law, thinking this is a great package for the Waitangi Tribunal. Spoiler alert, never worked for the Waitangi Tribunal, have never actually worked as a historian, but those qualifications have just stood me in incredible stead, and in particular I would really reference how important it was for me to understand the Te Ao Māori world back in the 90s this was, and moving into the public service. So you just never know quite where things will lead, and I think part of my message tonight is just always be open to opportunities, because if you have a set path it may just not pan out exactly how you think it might. I'm going to skip through a few things. My first job was at the Select Committee office, and day one I got into a lift with the Minister of Finance. I was such a political geek, I was so excited, it was really sad. But it really, really rang my bell working in Parliament, and then out of that I moved into some policy roles in central government agencies in Wellington. But fast forward a little bit, and I had left Wellington and moved to Otautahi, Christchurch, where I was working at the Ministry of Social Development, and I was leading a regional policy team. So I had somebody in the West Coast, somebody in Nelson, somebody in Dunedin, and somebody in Christchurch, and I was managing them. And it was a really cool job. It was really interesting, but I think if you're looking at the images up here, you're all going to know what I'm about to say. So how many people in the room are from Otautahi, Christchurch? There's a few of you, yeah. Will you guys remember the earthquakes? Yeah, you would have been quite young. Yeah. So I'll just give you a little bit of a background about the earthquake experience for those of you who weren't there. Rachel, who's going to speak soon, has shared her trauma of working through the earthquake recovery as well. But essentially there was a really significant earthquake in 22nd of February in 2011. It was, for those who care about these things, it was a 6.2 magnitude earthquake, and it was 6 kilometres deep. If an earthquake is, this is a little amateur seismologist sort of anecdote, if it's quite shallow, it can be much more disruptive than if it's a deep earthquake. And it was a really significant experience for all of New Zealand, but particularly for us in Christchurch. 185 people lost their lives, and there were 7,000 people injured. There were 100,000 properties damaged, including my own home. So I walked into my house with my 2-year-old and my 4-year-old, and the floor was covered in glass. Our toilets didn't function for about maybe 3 or 4 months. We were showering and doing other things at our neighbours. But we were just a tiny sample of what was happening in the city. There were 14,000 properties where they had to be demolished because of the level of damage immediately, and about another almost 8,000 were red zoned, where essentially these were properties around the river, and the land had been so damaged you would have to take the property away, remediate the land and rebuild. And so what the government did was offer buyouts. So the whole thing cost the New Zealand $52 billion. It was a really significant time in our history, and really interesting actually to learn about. For me, what that meant was at the Ministry of Social Development, we were responsible for welfare response under the Civil Defence legislation. So I found myself sitting in something called an EOC, an Emergency Operations Centre, and there were all these military people doing military things, and I was tasked with things like, where do the portaloos go? So you just have to kind of roll with these opportunities in life and figure out how to find out the answer to the question of where do we put the portaloos today. It was a really interesting experience, but after a couple of months there, maybe about 6 months there, the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority was established, and that's called SERA in short. So if I use the word SERA, I'm not talking about somebody called SERA, it's the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. That was set up by the government in Christchurch to lead the recovery response, and that was already controversial because essentially for people in Christchurch, and particularly the council, that was central government coming to town, Wellington coming to town and telling Christchurch how to be. So it was already sort of quite a tense space in terms of the interactions with the communities and also with some of the other agencies in town. My responsibility was to set up a monitoring framework, a social recovery monitoring framework. So what we wanted to do there was understand what was happening to the community so that we could then develop initiatives or programs that would respond to people's needs. And another declaration, I barely got school cert maths, but I'm suddenly running a statistical modelling part of an organisation. But really it was about going, okay, what's the data telling us? What are the key messages here? So we looked at admin data, what's happening with employment, what's happening with family violence, what's happening with crime, what's happening with health impacts. That admin data could tell us a certain story, but what we really needed to do was survey people and hear from people directly about how they were feeling and thinking about the earthquakes, what was happening in people's heads. And that's the bit where I think humanities comes into play, right? Because, data only gives you a certain amount, but information is where you can really translate these challenges. So, for example, we did a lot of demographic breakdowns, and we found that, the groups that were already vulnerable in society were having a harder time, because we'd lost so many properties, rents were going up, people who were on fixed incomes, low incomes were really struggling. We started seeing more homelessness than usual. But there were some groups that were kind of unexpected in terms of struggling with some of these challenges. So, and a lot of them were the crunched middle. So we're talking about often middle-aged women, I can relate to this myself now, who are trying to look after their children and bring them through recovery, and also maybe support their elderly parents, because a lot of it was about managing insurance payouts and insurance claims, rebuilding properties. Your children would be going to a different school and different, there was site sharing going on. I could go on for ages, but I guess I just wanted to mention a couple of things, which was that part of the challenge for us was living and working through recovery. So we were going home to our damaged properties, we were going home to stories about people we knew who were injured, or supporting friends who had lost loved ones. So it was a really challenging time, and I think the lesson is, there's not really a lesson because you can't engineer your career around a natural disaster, and I wouldn't want you to. But I guess it's just that, in a situation like that, some of the skills that you don't know that you have will come to the fore. And I think that's really important to remember. And, we were sitting in meetings with thousands of aftershocks and still being able to plan forward. Another motto that we kind of talked about a lot at the time was that we were building the plane as we were flying it, which was kind of us admitting we were winging it. We didn't really know. None of us had trained for how to manage a recovery. There's no manual, so we were really doing the best we could. And I think again, you just never know what you can achieve when you put into circumstances like that. I'm now going to jump to my other picture down the bottom left there, which is some of the beautiful coastline of Otautahi, Christchurch, although my heart remains in Dunedin, I would just like to say. So my role at the moment is that I lead the Christchurch City Council's climate adaptation work. So we work with communities and with runanga to plan for the impacts, primarily at the moment, of sea level rise. So that's coastal flooding, coastal erosion, rising groundwater. I've just been meeting today with the people in Dunedin City Council who are doing the same work in South Dunedin. So it's a challenge right across the whole country. In Christchurch, we've got almost 400 kilometres of coastline, and we've built a lot of stuff on our coastline, which in retrospect was not smart. But here we are. So what do we do now? It's a very multidisciplinary role, and what I love, that's almost my favourite thing about the job. In my team, I've got engineers, I've got traffic asset managers, I've got ecologists, economists, climate scientists, all sorts of different people. And they are incredible. They've all got their technical expertise, and their technical expertise is really important in this mix, clearly. But how does a humanities student kind of navigate? What's my role in all of this? And it's really thinking about how do I bring the community along in this process, because you can produce myriad stacks of data and analysis from a technical perspective, but if nobody's reading it or engaging it or understanding how it relates to them, it's kind of not really landing with anybody, is it? So I see myself as the naive inquirer, the generalist, the person who barely got through science at school, and I ask the dumb questions, and I ask the dumb questions to the point where the information becomes distilled enough that I understand how it matters. And then if I can understand it, I can help translate it into what does that mean for, the average person in the community who doesn't have a PhD in coastal geomorphology. So the things that I think I focus on at work are process. Now that might sound really boring, and if I was a student sitting here many years ago and someone said process is really interesting, I'd be like, geez. But it is, okay? So this is how you can actually determine who makes the decisions, who's engaged in the conversation, what influence do they have? Do they have influence on all parts of the process or only some parts of the process? So it's just process design is actually a really powerful tool when you're engaging and when you're working with multiple parties. And putting the person in the centre of that process is really the guts of what I'm trying to achieve there. Another part of my role is influence. We don't have a statutory process for adaptation planning in New Zealand. What that means is there's no legislation telling us how to do it. And there's also no legislation saying that the plans we come up with then become, or councils are required to follow them. So I have to think about how to keep people supporting the work that I do. Any day, if they didn't believe in the work that I do, the elected members, the councillors, could pull my budget. Communities could stop turning up and engaging in our meetings. If we didn't engage effectively with mana whenua, with runanga, we wouldn't be really working in partnership and we'd be making some really bad decisions. So a large part of the role is thinking, who do I need to influence? Who are the stakeholders here? How do I find a pathway forward to try and bring other people on this journey with me? But a big part of this is, of course, delivery. Thank you. Because there's no point just having lots of chats. You have to actually demonstrate delivery. And again, I think, that process and program management, sort of thinking about how you can design something at the outset that will lead to something at the end is really critical. So we've got our first adaptation plan across the line earlier this year. And we've also got, this is what I'm quite proud about, is our Climate Resilience Fund. So we know that climate change is going to impact future generations more than it has impacted older generations, but we know that future generations haven't caused the problem. They're just going to have to deal a lot with the challenges that it raises. So I did a business case essentially for council to rate people now, lock that money away, and then have it unlocked in 30 years' time as a sort of an intergenerational transfer of wealth. It's not going to be as much money as I'd like, but it's a start. And I think it's that kind of holistic thinking that, as humanities students, you can be creative, you can be innovative, you're not following a discipline, you can really think outside the square. So drawing together a few threads about some of the skills here, I think that my arts degree has really helped me being human-centred in anything I do. I think about how a person at the centre of any work I do will react to it, how to position it to try and draw their interest in and how to engage with them. And a lot of that is actually about turning data into information and thinking about it's always a trade. You know, why does somebody want to talk to you? You know, what's in it for them? How is something you're sharing going to help them with their lives and their decision making in the future? Another skill set I think is, and this is a classic arts skill set, is looking at a lot of information and discerning what's really important in it. There's a lot of noise out there, and in my space there's probably 4 research reports published every day. You know, it's just constantly coming at us. How do you forge a path through this myriad of information, through a multidisciplinary process where everybody has a view? How do you find a way forward and direct your team and get everybody kind of working in the same direction? And not getting distracted by noise or slowed down by it. The last thing I kind of wanted to mention on that front was judgment. I think that when you're an arts grad, you're always thinking about context, and you're always thinking about nuance, and you're always thinking about people's motivations. And reading the room is really important. So we often go into community meetings with people who are climate change deniers. You know, how do you approach that so that it's not turning into a battle? How do you get decisions through a council table when across the councillors you'll have some people that are really progressive and left-leaning, and you'll have others that are quite right-leaning and don't want to spend any more rates on anything? You know, how do you find an argument that's going to kind of appeal to both sides of that coin? Because ultimately you need people to buy into what you're trying to achieve if you're going to get anything done. So I think that understanding of context is really critical, and I think that's something that humanities students have a really strong handle on. The last question I was asked to address is, what would I tell myself if I was you many years ago, sitting here? And I think, honestly, the main thing is back yourself. You know, when you're in a workplace environment, put your hand up for hard things. And back yourself to deliver them. You know, you can problem solve, you can use your networks, you can research, you're smart people. You have all of the skills at hand. You know, be humble, because you're probably landing in a career path where there are people who have got a bit more experience and have been through a few more things. But, you know, the best thing you can have in your team, and I say this as a manager, are people who say, yeah, I'll give that a crack. And I think that's just something it's hard won, confidence. You know, it takes a while to get there, but just try and fake it till you make it. Yeah.